All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're doing a high-density anatomical dissection of 1 John 2:12 through 14 in the original Koine Greek. Now, just to be clear up front, we are setting aside all homiletic and pastoral applications today. We're focusing exclusively on empirical linguistic analysis. We're going to examine the very bones of this text using systemic functional linguistics and then map out its spatial discourse using the absolute latest in verbal aspect theory. Here is our roadmap for the analysis. We're going to cover textual architecture, SFL metafunctional analysis, Campbell's axis of proximity, aspectual peaks, and finally, the cohesive infrastructure. Section 1, Textual Architecture and Clause Map. Let's see exactly how this text builds its macro-level foundation. We've got to start by mapping the objective clause structure. And it's absolutely crucial that we anchor every single Greek reference by its specific standard biblical verse clause notation. Think 212a or 214f. When you lay the text out visually like this, it hits you right away. 1 John 2:12 through 14 isn't just some flowing stream of consciousness paragraph. It exhibits a remarkably strict two-part strophic structure, meticulously organized into two parallel triads. This mapping reveals a stunningly deliberate parallel strophic architecture. Check this out. Notice how the text alternates precisely between a present tense form frame in strophe 1 and an aorist tense form frame in strophe 2. And it doesn't stop there. These frames perfectly align across matching vocative pairings: children, fathers, and young men. The symmetry here is literally by design and forms the backbone of our entire linguistic analysis. Now, pay really close attention to the marked theme in clause 214f. Normally, you'd expect the verb or process to be the starting point, right? But here, the predicate attribute ischurioi, meaning strong, is fronted before the process este. By fronting this adjective, the author creates a highly marked, emphatic thematic anchor right before detailing the expanded grounds for the young adults. Section 2. SFL metafunctional analysis. With the architecture visible, it's time to dig right into the functional mechanics of the ideational and interpersonal metafunctions. So the crucial point of the ideational metafunction is categorizing the predicate process types. We're talking verbal, mental, relational, and material, and mapping their participant roles strictly without letting ourselves drift into theological application. For instance, look at clause 212a. Rapho is a verbal process with the author as the sayer. But then you move down to 213b, and egnokate transitions into a mental cognitive process. Here, the addressees are the censors, and the phenomenon they are processing is ton up archis. This strictly objective mapping shows us exactly how the text makes meaning at the clause level. Turning to the interpersonal metafunction, we want to analyze social distance in speech acts. What's wild here is the exclusive use of the indicative mood throughout this entire section. There are literally zero imperatives. None. Instead, the text alternates in this beautiful rhythmic pattern between direct epistolary addresses, like clause 212a, and heavily theological grounding assertives, like 212b. The authorial stance is entirely assertive, laying down profound theological certainty. Which brings us to section 3, Campbell's axis of proximity. This is really the climax of our explainer, mapping the rhetorical topography. Look, this is a massive paradigm shift for Koine Greek scholars. In this analysis, we are emphatically rejecting traditional temporal definitions of tense. We're tossing out ideas like past action with present results or ongoing consequences. They're gone. Instead, we are adopting Constantine Campbell's strictly spatial framework, viewing aspects subjectively along an axis of proximity and remoteness. So we're replacing the old temporal model with a strictly spatial one. This is a total game changer because it allows us to empirically analyze how the author manipulates spatial proximity to the discourse. Perfective aspect? That's an external, summary view. Think of it as the helicopter view. Imperfective aspect? That's an internal, unfolding view, the street view. Applying Campbell's axis directly to our verbs clarifies everything. The present tense form grafo gives us imperfective aspect, that unfolding street view that is physically near to the speaker. Then the aorist tense form, egrapsa, is perfective aspect. It steps back into spatial remoteness for a summary helicopter view. And crucially, the perfect tense form, ignokote, acts as imperfective aspect combined with heightened proximity. It literally acts as a spatial magnifying glass. Let's move on to section 4, aspectual peaks and discourse grounding. We need to observe this spatial manipulation in action.
When we look at the macro structure, the shift from the present tense grapho in strophe 1 to the aorist tense έγραψα in strophe 2 isn't about time at all. Actually, scratch that, let's be more precise. It is a deliberate rhetorical perspective shift. The author moves from a near, unfolding, street-level engagement with the audience into a remote, distant helicopter view that provides an authoritative, baseline summary frame for the exact same truths. So the key takeaway here is how the dependent OT clauses utilize perfect tense forms as absolute discourse peaks. We're talking verbs like apheanta, ignokate, and nenikikate. By choosing the perfect tense form, the author isn't signaling a past action. No, he is bringing the internal viewpoint into heightened proximity.
By selecting these perfect tense forms, the text applies a spatial zoom. It's the linguistic equivalent of stepping incredibly close to the parade to vividly intensify the processes of forgiveness, cognitive knowledge, and victory over the evil one. It makes the discourse focal point incredibly sharp, vivid, and intimately close to the audience. It's brilliant.
Finally, we head into Section 5, cohesive infrastructure and participant chains. Let's map the binding connective tissue that holds these complex spatial and structural shifts together. You know, a discourse totally falls apart without cohesion. This sequence graphically traces the primary familial lexical chain, progressing precisely through the strophic architecture we discussed earlier. From the general children, to the fathers, to the young adults, this lexical reiteration provides a rigid tracking mechanism. It's exactly what allows those spatial shifts between the present and aorist frames to occur without completely losing the reader. Furthermore, we absolutely must map the logical conjunctive architecture. Notice that the repeated Hody conjunctions, the ones that introduce those aspectual peaks we just analyzed, operate entirely on the internal plane. They do not map historical or chronological sequence on the external plane. Instead, they serve purely as internal rhetorical grounding, directly connecting the author's speech act to the theological status of the readers. This mapping exposes the incredibly dense network of cohesive ties at play here, from the R1 personal reference of the dative plural you mean, repeated in all 6 main clauses, all the way to the S1 nominal ellipsis where the first-person sayer is strictly elided into the verbal inflection. Guys, this isn't just repetition, it is a highly engineered infrastructure that firmly anchors the complex, shifting discursive architecture of the passage. As we wrap up this anatomical dissection, we're left with a truly paradigm-shifting question. When we stop looking for time where there is only space, how many other traditional translations in the Koine Greek corpus will completely unravel? The text is a landscape. It's about time we learned how to read the map.